There's a way to crush an empire without firing a single bullet. No armies, no occupation, no tanks rolling through streets, no bombers overhead. All you need is a signature on a loan document. Then you wait, because compound interest is deadlier than any weapon ever made. In the 19th century, the British and French empires toppled the mighty Ottoman Empire, not with soldiers, not with cannons, not with sieges, but with debt alone. They didn't storm Constantinople, they didn't storm the Sultan's palace, they just lent money the Ottomans could never repay, and then let financial mathematics do what 500 years of military campaigns couldn't. They conquered a superpower using accounting. And here's why you need to understand this now, January 2026. That same debt trap strategy that destroyed the Ottoman Empire is being used right now against developing nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Most shockingly, the United States is walking straight into the same trap. In the next 25 minutes, I'll show you the blueprint of how debt conquers nations, how it was perfected in the 1800s, how it's being deployed today, and why the pattern says America may have less than 10 years before we are the ones foreclosed upon. Let me begin with a story that should send chills down your spine, a preview of what's coming for America. The year is 1881, Istanbul. A group of European bankers walks into the Sultan's palace. Not generals, not soldiers, bankers with briefcases full of ledgers, showing exactly what the Ottoman Empire owes. They hand the Sultan a document that ends 600 years of Ottoman sovereignty. This creates the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA. It's not a government agency, it's a foreign corporation controlled by British, French, German, Italian, and Austrian bankers. And this corporation is granted something unprecedented, the legal right to directly collect taxes from Ottoman citizens and send that money straight to European creditors. Taxes on salt, silk, tobacco, fishing, spirits, stamp duties, everything is handed over to foreign control. The OPDA builds its own bureaucracy, hires over 5,000 tax collectors who wear uniforms, carry weapons, and answer not to the Sultan, but to bankers in London and Paris. For the next 33 years until World War I, this foreign corporation collects 1/3 of all revenue generated by the Ottoman economy. 1 out of every 3 coins anywhere in the empire goes directly to European banks, not the Ottoman government, not to build schools or roads or armies, straight to creditors. The Sultan, ruler of millions, becomes just a figurehead. He reigns, but he has no power because he has no money. He can't build infrastructure. He can't modernize the military. He can't invest in education or industry. 33% of all revenue is automatically seized and sent to Europe. This is what it looks like when a nation loses its sovereignty to debt. The flag still flies, the border still exists, but the country is no longer independent. It has become a colony, a debt colony, and this is the fate awaiting any nation that crosses the debt threshold and can't pay, potentially even the United States. To understand how we got here and where we're going, you need to see the full pattern, the blueprint, the step-by-step process of how debt traps work. This isn't random, it's not bad luck. It's a precision weapon refined over centuries, following the exact same sequence every single time. You can't trap a strong, prosperous nation with debt. They don't need to borrow. So you wait. Wait for crisis, war, natural disaster, economic collapse, political instability. When a nation is desperate, when it's facing an existential threat, that's when you offer the loan. For the Ottoman Empire, the crisis was the Crimean War of 1853. Russia invaded Ottoman territory. The Ottomans were fighting for survival, but didn't have the money to fund the war. Britain and France, fearing Russian expansion, offered help. Not just armies, but bankers carrying ledgers. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire took its first foreign loan from British and French banks. It was presented as solidarity, alliance, a lifeline to save the empire. But the terms were predatory from day one. The loan's issue price was 80%. For every 100 pounds of debt the Sultan signed for, he only received 80 pounds in cash. The banks kept 20 as commission and risk premium. Here's the trap. The Ottomans had to pay interest on the full 100 pounds, not the 80 they actually received. The effective interest rate was punishingly high, but the Sultan was desperate. The money arrived, the crisis was solved, the Russians were eventually defeated, and the Ottoman elite learned a dangerous lesson. Any problem can be solved instantly with borrowed money. Once a nation takes the first loan and it works, they become addicted. The Ottoman Sultan looked at the shining capitals of Europe, London and Paris, with their gaslit boulevards and opera houses, and felt inferior. He wanted to prove the Ottoman Empire was modern, civilized, powerful, so he borrowed to fund prestige projects. The Dolabak Palace, Sultan Abd decided the old palace, home of sultans for 400 years, was too outdated. He wanted a palace that rivaled Versailles, so he built the Dolabahce Palace on the shores of the Bosphorus. The cost, 5 million Ottoman gold, equivalent to 1/4 of the empire's entire annual tax revenue. One building cost 25% of yearly government income, built entirely with borrowed money. The palace contained 14 tons of gold leaf, the largest crystal chandelier in the world, Baccarat crystal staircases, Italian marble walls, stunningly beautiful, and a tombstone, a monument to fiscal insanity. But it didn't stop there. The Sultan also decided he wanted a modern navy to match Britain's. He ordered massive, ironclad warships from British shipyards, bought the latest cannons from Germany. For a brief moment, the Ottoman navy was the third largest in the world, on paper. But the empire couldn't afford to fuel or maintain these ships. They sat in the harbor, rusting, floating monuments to debt. To pay for all this, the Sultan went back to the banks. 1855, another loan. 1858, another. 1860, another. Each time, the British and French banks were happy to lend, making fortunes on commissions and high interest. They assumed Britain and France would never let the Ottomans fail. They were too geopolitically important. This is called moral hazard. The banks took insane risks, believing governments would bail them out. Sound familiar? Financial crisis, anyone? By the 1860s, the Ottoman finances were a classic Ponzi scheme. The empire wasn't generating enough tax revenue to pay interest on existing loans, so it took out new loans to pay interest on old loans, digging holes to fill holes. By 1860, the empire was spending about 15% of revenue on debt service. By 1870, that number had soared to 50%. Read that again. Half of all government revenue was going just to pay interest to foreign creditors. That left no money for the army, the navy, schools, infrastructure, nothing. The state was being hollowed out from the inside. To keep the scheme alive, the government turned to local loan sharks, the Galata bankers of Istanbul, borrowing at short-term rates of 18% to 20% just to make it to the next big European loan. It was financial suicide in slow motion. The tipping point came in 1873. A financial panic erupted in Vienna and spread globally, triggering the Long Depression. European banks, facing their own crisis, stopped lending. The music stopped. At the same time, a catastrophic drought hit Anatolia. Crops failed, animals died, peasants, the tax base, faced starvation. Tax revenues collapsed, but debt payments remained fixed. In October 1875, the Grand Vizier looked at the ledgers and realized it was over. The treasury was empty. A massive payment was due to European bondholders, and there was no money to pay it. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued the Decree of Muharram, announcing it would cut debt payments in half, 50% in cash, 50% in IOUs. In diplomatic language, this was a moratorium. In reality, it was default, bankruptcy. The reaction in Europe was furious. Millions of middle-class British and French investors who had bought high-yield Ottoman bonds watched their savings vanish. Newspapers screamed that the Turks were thieves. The diplomatic support Britain and France had given the Ottomans vanished, and seeing weakness, Russia attacked. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 was a catastrophe. The Ottoman army, unpaid and undersupplied, was crushed. Russia marched to the suburbs of Istanbul. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, surrendering vast territories and agreeing to pay massive war reparations. The total debt now exceeded the entire value of the Ottoman economy. The empire was insolvent, defenseless, and friendless. This is where the trap snaps shut. The European powers could have invaded and annexed Ottoman territories outright, but that would have been expensive and messy, requiring armies and administration. They had a smarter idea: financial conquest. In 1881, representatives of European bondholders came to Istanbul, not with armies, but with briefcases. They dictated the terms of surrender, creating the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA, a mechanism of soft conquest, a foreign corporation given legal control over Ottoman revenue streams. The decree handed over the empire's most valuable taxes directly to this corporation: silk, salt, fishing, spirits, tobacco, stamp duties, all transferred to European control. The OPDA built a parallel state, hired 5,000 armed tax collectors, built warehouses, modernized industries, but everything benefited European creditors, not Ottoman citizens. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected 1/3 of all Ottoman revenue and shipped it to Europe. The Ottoman government was left with scraps. They couldn't invest in education, infrastructure, or industry. They were trapped in permanent underdevelopment because their surplus wealth was being extracted through the debt trap. The Sultan became a puppet. He reigned, but the OPDA ruled. This continued until World War I, when the Ottomans gambled everything by joining Germany, hoping victory would erase the debt. They lost. The empire was destroyed, but the debt survived. When the Turkish Republic was founded in 1923, European powers demanded the new nation pay the old empire's debts. At the Treaty of Lausanne, they made the argument simple: you inherited the land, you inherit the mortgage. The new republic, shattered by war, spent its first 30 years sending millions abroad to pay for Sultanate vanity projects built in the 1850s. The final payment on Ottoman debt was made on May 25, 1954. Exactly 100 years to pay off one mistake. 100 years of wealth extraction, 4 generations paying for decisions made by leaders who had been dead for a century. That is the power of the debt trap. And here's why this matters to you right now in 2026. Because this exact blueprint is being used today. China is deploying it across Africa and Asia. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, the IMF and World Bank used it across Latin America and Africa for decades. And most terrifying of all, the United States is walking into the same trap. But this time, we are the Ottoman Empire, not the British. Look at the modern applications. Sri Lanka borrowed from China to build the Hambantota port. It couldn't repay. In 2017, Sri Lanka handed the port to China on a 99-year lease. A Chinese corporation now controls Sri Lankan territory. Pakistan borrowed $62 billion from China for infrastructure. It can't repay. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor gives China control over strategic assets and territory. Djibouti borrowed heavily, debt to GDP hit 88%. China now operates a military base there. Kenya borrowed for a railway. A debt crisis followed. China gained economic leverage. Zambia borrowed for infrastructure, defaulted in 2020, and Chinese creditors are now negotiating control over mines and assets. This is the Ottoman debt trap playbook, executed in the 21st century. Lend to developing nations for infrastructure they can't afford. Wait for default, seize strategic assets, strip sovereignty. Now comes the terrifying part. The United States is in the Ottoman Empire's position. U.S. national debt, $38 trillion. Debt to GDP, 128%. Interest payments, $1.2 trillion per year, over 20% of federal revenue. Foreign creditors hold $8 trillion in U.S. debt, with China, Japan, and others as major holders. We're not at foreclosure yet, but we're deep in the Ponzi spiral. We borrow new money to pay interest on old debt. Over 20% of revenue goes to debt service. We can't invest in infrastructure, education, or industry because the debt consumes everything. And when we can't pay, what happens then? What happens when we reach default? Let me show you what the foreclosure of America would look like. Because it won't come through tanks or troops, it will come through financial conquest. China, as the largest foreign creditor, negotiates debt restructuring in exchange for control over strategic ports, Long Beach, Seattle, and others, and ownership stakes in critical infrastructure, power grids, communications, territorial concessions, even 99-year leases on land like Hong Kong was to Britain. The US government could be forced to hand over tax revenues from specific sectors directly to foreign creditors, just like the OPDA, an international debt administration created with representatives from China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and the EU. This foreign corporation would have legal authority to collect portions of US taxes and send them directly to creditors. American sovereignty would effectively end while the flag still flies. It sounds impossible, absurd. America's too powerful. We have nukes, we have the world's strongest military, but so did the Ottoman Empire relative to their era. They had the largest army in Europe for centuries. It didn't matter because military power means nothing when you're financially conquered. You can't pay soldiers with debt. You can't run a navy on I owe us. When the money runs out, the power disappears. And right now we're watching the money run out in real time. Here's the timeline for the US based on the Ottoman pattern, 2020 to 2024, addiction phase. COVID spending, $5 trillion printed, infrastructure bills, debt exploded from $23 trillion to $38 trillion in just 4 years, 2024 to 2027, Ponzi spiral. We're here now, borrowing to pay interest, deficits over $2 trillion annually, interest costs rising exponentially, 2027 to 2030, default window. If debt to GDP crosses 140 to 150% without crisis, we enter the historical default zone. Foreign creditors panic, treasury auctions fail, Fed forced to monetize debt, currency crisis, 2030 to 2035. Foreclosure. Some form of international debt restructuring, loss of financial sovereignty, foreign control over U.S. economic policy and assets. This is the timeline if current trends continue, and nothing suggests they'll change. Neither political party will cut spending enough nor raise taxes enough. The math is unsustainable. The trap is closing. So what do? How do you prepare for your country being financially conquered? First, understand this. Sovereignty at the national level translates to solvency at the personal level. If you don't own your debt owns you. Eliminate personal debt, especially high-interest consumer debt, as aggressively as possible. Position in hard assets that can't be inflated away or confiscated easily: gold, silver, Bitcoin, real estate, productive land. Don't trust that dollar-denominated paper assets will maintain value through a sovereign debt crisis. Build skills that produce real value, regardless of which system is in power: medical, agricultural, mechanical, anything tangible. Have international optionality. Diversify assets across jurisdictions. Maintain the ability to leave if the US enters a foreclosure scenario. Watch the indicators: debt to GDP crossing 140%, failed treasury auctions, creation of international oversight of US fiscal policy. That's stage 4 beginning, stage 5 is coming. The story of the Ottoman Empire isn't ancient history. It's a blueprint, a warning, a pattern that repeats, because the mathematics of debt never change. Compound interest is the most powerful force in finance. When a nation borrows more than it can ever repay, it loses sovereignty. Not all at once, but slowly, by degrees, until one day you wake up and realize foreigners control your tax system, your ports, your infrastructure, and there's nothing you can do because you're bankrupt. The Ottomans learned this lesson over 100 years. We're going to learn it in 10. If this showed you a pattern you've never seen before, subscribe immediately. The next video covers the specific assets and strategies that survive sovereign debt crises based on every historical example. You need to see it. The debt trap isn't coming. We're already in it. The question is whether you recognize it before the foreclosure.